Y'all feel powerful today?
Mm-hmm.
Alright, I know it's not a lot of us in the room, but we need more energy than that. Do y'all feel powerful today?
Yes.
Alright, all power to the people?
All power to the people.
All power to the people?
All power to the people.
All power to the people?
All power to the people.
Alright, and black power to the black people. Happy Black History Month. Alright. This year is 100 years of Black History Month. Black History Month was officially, its beginnings, rather, were started in 1916 by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who started it as Negro History Week. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was an educator. If you haven't read his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, I would highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books that I recommend to anyone who is looking to find an entry point into studying Black history. And so we want to, of course, recognize Dr. Carter G. Woodson for his contributions to ensuring that Black history is celebrated and highlighted during the month of February. Today, February 21st, also marks the anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination on February 21st, 1965, when he was shot at the Audubon, giving his last speech. Just a week before that, on Valentine's Day, his house was firebombed while him, his wife, and kids were sleeping. And so today we also want to recognize the anniversary of his assassination and just recognize how much of a pivotal figure he was. As today we are discussing Black resistance, Malcolm X is possibly one of the most, if not the most influential figures of the 20th century, 21st century when we're talking about Black resistance and its history. Also want to honor the life of Jesse Jackson, who passed away not too long ago. One of the last remaining civil rights icons from his time, and so also want to honor his memory as well. All right, welcome. Come on in. All right. So today, as many of you, if you saw the flyer, we are discussing the philosophies and politics of Black resistance. And so what we like to do with these talks is not only discuss these ideas, but emphasize that these are discussions for political education. And for us in the new Vanguard, political education is not just something we do to know a bunch of stuff, but we learn, we discuss, and we study history for the sake of organizing and mobilizing. We want to learn so we can know how to do and know how to do correctly. And so, taking into context the current political landscape that we live in, there's a lot of conversations that are happening today around resistance, how to resist, what strategies to employ for resistance, and the outcomes of resistance to the current repressive forces that we're facing. So for Black History Month, I figured what other best way to understand resistance than to take a look at the philosophies and the politics of Black resistance, given that other than the indigenous people of the lands that we call the United States, Black people have the longest and most consistent history of resistance in this country. And so during this presentation or this talk, and as I mentioned, we're going to make it a little bit more conversational. There are going to be a lot of definitions. We're going to talk about a lot of definitions, different ideas defining these politics and philosophies, because I want us to, one, clearly understand what it is that we're talking about. A lot of times when people disagree on certain politics or philosophies, they're really not disagreeing about the content of those philosophies, but rather that they have different definitions of what those things are. And so we want to make sure that we're working with a sort of foundational understanding of these philosophies and politics so that we can have a real conversation around the actual content of these things. And so there's a microphone in the crowd, so if at any point you have a question about a word that I say, please feel free to ask for a clearer definition if I don't define it already. But also at different points I will be referring to you all to define certain terms and definitions of things that we'll be talking about, right? Because we don't want to go into this assuming that you all don't know, right? You all may also have a lot of insight and knowledge to these terms and philosophies and politics that we'll be discussing. So with this talk being titled The Philosophies and Politics of Black Resistance, we first have to understand what philosophy and politics are. So I'll start with you all. How do you all, if anybody wants to define philosophy and someone else wants to define politics, how do you all define philosophy and politics? Can you pass the microphone around? And there's a button on the side, just make sure it's on.
I'll answer the first question.
Yeah.
I'll define philosophy as your world outlook, the way you view the world, you interpret it. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And does somebody else want to define politics for us? Nobody shy. Y'all smart. All right, so I looked at a lot of different definitions, but there are a few that I'll use here. So philosophy, as the gentleman mentioned, is your world outlook, right? Philosophy is generally defined as the systemic study of ideas and issues, a reasoned pursuit of fundamental truths, and a quest for comprehensive understanding of the world. And if we want to talk about politics, politics is usually defined as a set of activities that are associated with decision-making in groups or other forms of power relations amongst individuals or groups. Now, the reason why those two terms are important to discuss and define as we're talking about black resistance is that in resistance against oppression, we are in pursuit of truth and of power. Those two things are essential to building a successful resistance movement. And so next we have to define what resistance actually is. And so when we're going to be talking about resistance throughout today, what I will be more so specifically referring to is organized resistance. And organized resistance is a structured and purposeful effort by a group to oppose, undermine, overthrow, and occupying power, government, or authority, often utilizing both violent and nonviolent methods. And so the history of organized black resistance movements goes back as far as the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade itself. This is important because it brings us to the first two philosophies that we have just mentioned, which are the methods through which people approach resistance, violent and nonviolent methods. And the important thing to remember here with those two things is that those are the means to an end, but not necessarily the ends themselves, right? And so violent resistance usually refers to the use of physical force to disrupt, overthrow, or force political, economic, or social change. And so this can manifest in the form of rebellions, uprisings, armed resistance, and more. Nonviolent resistance, on the other hand, typically refers to the use of civil disobedience to disrupt and undermine an oppressive authority. And so it's important to understand that any successful resistance movement does not limit itself to the use of just one of these methods, but makes use of both of them in situations where they are appropriate and accessible. During the slave trade and slavery, enslaved and kidnapped Africans resisted violently in the form of uprisings and rebellions on slave ships and plantations. On the continent, Africans fought wars and battles against enslavers and raiders attempting to take them into slavery. But they also made use of nonviolent methods. On the plantation, enslaved individuals used hunger strikes, breaking tools, faking illnesses, or weaponizing incompetence to avoid performing labor. In extreme circumstances, captives and enslaved Africans would take their own lives when they felt that there was no other way out. Both methods of resistance were necessary for the survival and freedom of these individuals throughout history. And black resistance has come in the form of both nonviolent and violent actions. During the civil rights movement, although it's mostly taught as a nonviolent movement, it also had within it violent resistance and probably would not have been successful otherwise. While the sector of the movement that is largely credited to Dr. King's leadership carried out nonviolent actions like sit-ins and boycotts, marches, and other forms of civil disobedience, you also had, for example, the Deacons for Defense down in Louisiana, who were an armed group of clergymen that protected the black community and their leaders from Ku Klux Klan violence. You had individuals like Robert F. Williams, who was kicked out of the NAACP for suggesting that black people armed themselves for self-defense, And there are many more examples of this that we'll talk about throughout this discussion. So nonviolent and violent resistance, as I mentioned earlier, are a means to an end, but not necessarily the ends themselves. So typically when we're discussing the ends of resistance, there's two categories that we can put them in. We can put them in the category of reform, and we can put them in the category of revolution. Does anyone want to define reform? And we can have someone else give us their definition of revolution. And we pass the mic down to Milledgeville.
Yep. Alright. So I guess I'll define reform. Reform for me would be change within a system that's already in place. It notices the problems, and so it tries to fix those problems within the system that's already prevalent.
All right. Somebody else want to define revolution?
How y'all doing?
All right.
Good.
Alright, so revolution. So I think revolution is like probably a temporary or permanent like restructure of the power system. Or, yeah.
All right. Thank y'all for those definitions. So, as Demetrius mentioned, reform is usually the approach of making improvements to a system, but not attempting to change the system entirely. Whereas revolution takes on the understanding that the system itself needs to change. We need something completely new, right? So resistance with the end goal of reform usually takes on the philosophy that the goals of resistance can be achieved by making changes or improvements to the society or system without completely changing what it is. Resistance with the end goal of revolution, on the other hand, is based on the philosophy that only a completely new social order, new form of government, and a new system can achieve the goals of resistance. And so just like violent and nonviolent resistance, reform and revolution have both had their place in black resistance movements over the years. And strategically, reform can be used to address some immediate concerns and issues, and revolution is usually geared towards something more sustainable and long-term. And this is that these approaches are used in the right way. And so we can look at an example by taking a look at the abolition of slavery in the United States versus the abolition of slavery in Haiti, right? The abolition of chattel slavery in the United States was a reformation that was credited to, but not entirely due to a constitutional amendment known as the 13th Amendment. Now, can anybody state for us what the 13th Amendment says?
I don't know, like, verbatim, but it basically makes slavery illegal, but only to be used as a way of punishment, like prison.
Right.
Yeah.
So, exactly what she stated. And the 13th Amendment went through stages as well. So originally it only abolished, the Emancipation Proclamation only abolished slavery in the rebellion states, right? So all of the states that had seceded and become the Confederacy, that is where slavery was originally only abolished there as a means to reduce the economic power of those states during the times of war. And then later on, as you mentioned, the 13th Amendment went on to abolish slavery unless used as a form of punishment. And so what this does is that loophole in the amendment made it possible for other forms of re-enslavement to be possible. So we think about things like sharecropping, we think about things like debt slavery, and eventually convict leasing and the creation of the prison industrial complex. Now, in Haiti, however, the abolition of slavery was accomplished through the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is the only slave revolt in history to result in the creation of an independent nation. The Haitians overthrew the established order and aimed to establish a new political, economic, and social system that guaranteed the freedom of all of its people. And the Haitian Revolution was so successful, in fact, that slave masters in the United States were afraid that enslaved people here would be inspired by the Haitian Revolution and lead their own uprisings. And so while the reformist approach to abolition in the United States addressed an immediate and urgent issue, it did not, however, dismantle the underlying economic and political structure that supported slavery and was built up by slavery. Other examples of reformers' approaches to resistance are, again, when we take a look at the civil rights movement, that was largely focused on expanding voting rights, job access, and desegregating public facilities and institutions. We can also think about the Black Lives Matter movement, which aims to achieve legislative changes that would address police brutality in the United States. Reform, again, usually assumes that if enough accommodations are made, the wrongs of the system can be made right. But usually that only works when you are dealing with a system that is made to be changed in that way. And so revolutionary resistance usually attempts to address this problem by pursuing acts of self-determination. Does anybody want to define self-determination for us? Or to take a guess at what it means?
Harris said a quote that says the revolution will not be televised.
Mm-hmm.
What he was speaking about was the revolution inside your mind, knowing that you have self-determination, which is something that comes from within you, that makes you know who you are, what you're willing to fight for, and whether there needs to be reform or revolution, and whether you need to be a part of it.
Absolutely. And so self-determination, as she talks about on a personal level, is knowing what it is that you're willing to fight for. And on a grand level, self-determination talks about the rights of a people to be able to determine their own destiny. And so this philosophy was at the core of many Black revolutionary resistance movements. And at the core of that philosophy was the question of land. Again, we think about the abolition of slavery after the Civil War, when Sherman was sent down to the South to talk to the freedmen and ask them what it is that they needed to be able to take care of themselves. What he was told by the freedmen he spoke to was that they needed land that they could make their own, to grow their own food and to build their own communities. Because at the time, Black people felt that the hatred that existed in their former slave masters made it too dangerous for them to be able to live in an integrated society. And so this is where the decree of 40 acres and a mule came from, where free Black people were promised 40 acres and a mule to be able to develop their own land and build their own communities, to be able to determine their own destiny. And we can also look forward to works of revolutionaries like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a civil rights icon in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer fought for voting rights of Black folks in Sunflower County, Mississippi, and eventually went on to acquire a 600-acre land project that she called the Freedom Farm Cooperative. And with that 600 acres of land, she was able to provide to poor people in her county land for housing, for farming, and to be able to develop the land to take care of themselves. Because what she understood was that people needed to be able to have self-determination and determine their own destiny to be truly free. Malcolm X once said that revolutions are fought to get control of land, to remove absentee landlords and gain control of the land and the institutions that flow from it. Malcolm X's analysis on revolution, land, and the philosophy of self-determination inspired movements like the Republic of New Africa. Founded in the late 1960s, the New African movement asserts that Black people in the United States are colonized people who should fight for their self-determination and should have a nation of their own, to be able to control their own destiny. This nation was to consist of 5 states in the Black Belt region of the southeastern U.S., which are Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. This nation will be formed in cooperation with the indigenous people of the region to provide a new national identity for Black people on this land. And so to advocate for this distinct national identity, to fight for self-determination, for land, and the creation of institutions that serve the needs of Black people and provide protection from systemic racism, was an idea known as black nationalism. And so again, to quote Malcolm X, he says, "My political philosophy is black nationalism, my economic philosophy is black nationalism, my social philosophy is black nationalism." When I say that, this philosophy means to me that it is designed to encourage our people, black people, to gain complete control over the politics and politicians of our own community. Over our economic philosophy is that we should gain control over the economy of our community, the businesses, and other things that create employment so that we can provide jobs for our own people instead of having to picket and boycott and beg somebody else for a job. And so although black nationalism reached its mainstream visibility in the 60s and the 70s, it had been a part of the fabric of black resistance movements since the Civil War era and co-evolved with another philosophy called Pan-Africanism. Is anyone familiar with Pan-Africanism and wants to define that for us? Where the microphone go?
Alright, so Pan-Africanism, that's like the all-encompassing idea of like solidarity between black people internationally and domestically, and our collective fight for liberation.
Absolutely, perfectly described. All right, can we give him a hand of applause? That was amazing. All right, so as he said, Pan-Africanism, broadly understood, is the philosophy and political ideology that people of African descent around the world are engaged in a shared struggle, and that our ultimate liberation is dependent on solidarity amongst the diaspora. And this philosophy is among some of the oldest and most consistent in the history of black resistance. As far back as the 1850s, you had individuals like Martin Robinson Delany, whose father was enslaved but his mother was free, and so she was able to take him and his siblings to Philadelphia to escape enslavement. In 1859, he led a commission to West Africa to explore lands for the creation of a nation for black people. Delany believed that white people would never be able to see black people as equals, and he wrote, "We are a nation within a nation, and we must go from our oppressors." He is also credited for coining the term Africa for Africans. Delany's efforts are grounded firmly in both the idea of a black national identity and a connection with the African continent and the diaspora. The call for Pan-Africanism was a natural response to not only the horrors of the slave trade, but also the colonization of the African continent and all forms of oppression against people of African descent. All around the world, in the 1900s, the first Pan-African Congress was organized in London by Henry Sylvester Williams, and this marked the beginnings of the organized Pan-African movement as we know it today. The person often noted as the most influential Pan-African of the 20th century is Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a man born in Jamaica, inspired by the work of Booker T. Washington. And in 1914, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which gave us the red, black, and green flag, which remains one of the most inspiring symbols of Pan-Africanism to this day. Garvey eventually established his headquarters in Harlem, New York, where his movement grew considerably. His organization had a newspaper, it had a ship line, grocery stores, laundromats, and other black-owned businesses. Garvey's mission was to instill pride in members of the black race and to highlight contributions of African people throughout history. Garvey's first and second wives, Amy Ashford Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey, were instrumental in the movement as organizers and also publishers of Pan-African literature. The principles of the Pan-African movement were so strong that even individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who originally was opposed to Marcus Garvey's ideas and tactics, eventually became a Pan-African himself. After leaving the NAACP in 1934 due to their lack of commitment to the economic situation of poor black people and black workers, Du Bois shifted towards black nationalism and Pan-African politics, and he was even the president of the 1945 Pan-African Congress and spent the latter part of his life in Ghana when he eventually passed away. Black people in America have always shown great reverence for their African identity, at times even going as far as being willing to defend an African country during a time of war. In 1935, when Italy attempted to invade and colonize Ethiopia, black men and women from all over the world rose up in outrage, some even volunteering to go fight for Ethiopia. Over 20,000 black men and women marched in Harlem in protest against Italy's attempted invasion of the African nation. And close to 10,000 black men in Chicago, Detroit, and Kansas signed up to go fight for Ethiopia. But the United States government, of course, wasn't going to let that happen. and even threatened to imprison anyone who tried. But ultimately, there was one man who was able to make it over there, and his name was John C. Robinson, and he was a black aviator who was personally invited by the Emperor Haile Selassie II to come and serve in the Ethiopia Imperial Air Force against Italy. And Robinson eventually came back to advocate for the development of the aviation program at Tuskegee and is considered the father of the Tuskegee Airmen. A black nurse in Harlem, in the Harlem Hospital by the name of Celeria Key, who was born in Milledgeville, Georgia in 1913, also collected funds to develop medical supplies to Ethiopia during the war. So even Milledgeville can produce revolutionaries, y'all. What helped strengthen the Pan-African movement even more was the wave of independence coming from the African continent, with Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence in 1957, and welcomed black leaders from the U.S. such as Dr. King and Malcolm X. At the core of Pan-Africanism in the 1960s was also socialism and communism, and I know that's a scary word, please y'all don't run away. Would anyone like to try to define socialism and define communism? All right, we got two hands over here. Who wants to take socialism and who wants to take communism? All right, he'll do communism and she'll do socialism. All right.
So socialism is the transitionary state between capitalism and communism.
All right, communism, that's when workers own like the means of production in the society.
All right. We're getting close. All right, at least y'all didn't say something crazy. So, let's first define socialism. So, socialism, as you said, many understand it to be the transitionary stage between capitalism and communism. So, socialism, simply defined, is a political and economic structure under which there is either a collective ownership of the means of production or state ownership of the means of production for the purpose of social welfare. So things like factories, farms, and banks are either owned by a workers' cooperative, or owned by the public, or owned by the state, with the goal of prioritizing the well-being of society and creating a more equitable distribution of wealth. Meaning that industry is not primarily profit-driven, and you don't have CEOs and owners who are making billions of dollars while the workers are barely making a livable wage. And so there are different approaches to socialism that, I won't have time to get into all of it today, but if you want to learn more, you can always join the new Vanguard, and we're very happy to provide you with a thorough political education. And so, as she mentioned, socialism is considered a step towards communism and an intermediary stage between capitalism and communism. And communism, simply defined, is a political and economic structure where there is no state, there are no social or economic classes, there is no money. Every individual contributes to society to the best of their ability and receive resources based on their needs. People are self-governed and operate in small societies or communes rather than under a state government. So when you hear people say a communist country, that is a contradiction within itself, because communism states that there would be no state government, right? So that is how American propaganda sometimes will try to confuse us on what these things mean. Socialist and communist politics have always been present in black resistance movements. In 1919, an organization known as the African Blood Brotherhood was formed in New York to defend black people from racial violence, and was also later allied with the U.S. Communist Party. Members of the African Blood Brotherhood also advocated for the Black Belt Republic, very similarly to the Republic of New Africa, which was a call for the formation of a black nation from the state of Virginia to East Texas. The book Hammer and Hoe by Robert D.G. Kelly is a historical account of how in the 1930s and 40s, the Communist Party in Alabama organized black sharecroppers, industrial workers, and women to fight against racial oppression and for economic justice. Paul Robeson, a famous black actor, singer, and civil rights activist of the 30s through the 60s, received heavy criticism and was questioned by the U.S. government for his visits to the Soviet Union, where he said for the first time in his life he felt like a human being. The term communist was often thrown around by the U.S. government to try to discredit black resistance movements because they understood that people were generally ignorant about what it meant. They even tried to accuse Dr. King of being a communist at one point. And although he wasn't, King, towards the end of his life, became very critical of capitalism, stating that this country practices socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. King advocated for reparations, redistribution of wealth, and workers' rights up until the day he was assassinated. Anti-capitalist politics carried over into the late 60s and early 70s with the emergence of the Black Power movement and organizations like the Black Panther Party and the wave of independence sweeping across the African continent that saw the emergence of socialist governments in Africa. The Black Power movement was sparked by individuals like Kwame Ture and members of SNCC, formerly known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, changed to the Student National Coordinating Committee, that advocated for the Black community to take control of its own politics, economics, and social affairs using any means necessary. The movement was critical of some of the tactics of the civil rights movement, and the civil rights leaders were critical of the Black Power movement of being too radical. And it's important to know that many of the students who sparked the Black Power movement were actually involved in the civil rights movement themselves. And so this was a natural progression of a movement that they had already been a part of. And so the Black Power movement emphasized the exploitative nature of capitalism and the need for a new system that would be more beneficial for the welfare of Black people of all economic and social classes, leaning heavily towards socialism and communism. In the spirit of the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland, California in 1966. And that was an organization that taught and advocated, but more importantly, practiced socialist politics. Many people know the Black Panthers for carrying around guns and wearing black berets and leather jackets. But what made them more impactful as an organization, and especially relevant to the local community, was their initiatives that collectively were known as the Survival Pending Revolution programs. And these programs consisted of over 60 community-based anti-capitalist initiatives launched in the 1960s and 1970s to meet the basic needs of their community. And they provided things such as free food, healthcare, education, transportation, and more. These programs were intended to empower oppressed communities, build solidarity, and to foster revolutionary consciousness while providing essential services. But the Panthers, like many other Black revolutionary organizations and figures, were not only concerned with what was happening on American soil, but they understood that the liberation of Black people in America is also connected to the liberation of oppressed people all over the world. Black resistance has always had an international context because it understands that the same oppressive forces that are working against us in the United States are the same oppressive forces working against other people around the world. The transatlantic slave trade and colonialism created a connection between global forces of evil in ways that the world had never seen before. And so internationalism became a necessity for ultimate liberation. Building solidarity between revolutionary forces and oppressed communities around the world to defeat imperialism became necessary. Does anyone want to define imperialism for us?
Imperialism, as defined by Vladimir Lenin, is the highest stage of capitalism. And there's like 5 things.
Yeah, we don't gotta go into all that, but that was a good definition. And so we have to understand that Pan-Africanism is a form of internationalism. Paul Robeson's relationship with the Soviets was a form of internationalism. When Dr. King told us that we must support the revolutions happening all around the world, he was making a call for internationalism. When Fidel Castro visited the United States and went to Harlem to meet with Malcolm X, that was internationalism. When the Black Panther Party visited Palestinian revolutionaries in Lebanon or visited with Chinese revolutionaries in China, that was internationalism. And so the Black Panther Party leader, Huey P. Newton, had what I call an advanced analysis of internationalism, which he called intercommunalism. And what he stated was that nation states had become obsolete and that the world had been reduced into communities that are controlled by a central empire and multinational corporations. And therefore, liberation struggles have to extend beyond our national borders. And what he also stated was that this was ultimately a phenomenon that was driven by capitalism. And capitalism, as we understand it, is a system where the means of production are owned and controlled by private individuals and private corporations. And so in this system, people are forced to sell their labor to be able to live, and sometimes labor is even exploited for free, as we have seen with the slave trade. Ownership under capitalism is limited and monopolized by a few at the expense of everyone else. And so, although Hewlett's theory was developed at a time when industry was globalizing, I believe that the transatlantic slave trade was the beginning of intercommunalism. The slave trade and colonization created industries and companies that had to operate on an international scale and had real influence in the development of nations. In addition to companies, institutions like the Roman Catholic Church lent their power and influence to legitimize the slave trade. Then in 1885, European countries and corporations came together in Berlin to divide up the African continent amongst themselves to decide how they would colonize the land. In these instances, we have institutions, countries, and multinational entities taking decisive actions that impact the destinies of people around the world. And it set the stage and began to tie together the destinies of people all around the globe. So you have circumstances like King Leopold II, who was able to privately own the Congo and fund a genocide for the production of rubber. You have diamond companies that continue to exploit the African continent. You have situations like the United Fruit Company, also known today as Chiquita Bananas, that partnered with the CIA in the 1950s to overthrow the government of Guatemala. Or you have Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Company, who was a supporter and a supplier of the Nazi government during World War II. And many more such examples. And so, as we stated, this is the natural progression of capitalism. Malcolm X says, "You show me a capitalist and I'll show you a bloodsucker." Assata Shakur said that there was not a single liberation movement in the whole world that was fighting for capitalism. The whole thing boiled down to a simple question. Anything that has any kind of value is mined, grown, produced, and processed by working people. So why shouldn't working people collectively own that wealth? Why shouldn't working people own and control their own resources? Capitalism meant that rich businessmen owned the wealth, while socialism meant that the people who made the wealth owned it. Beyond economics and race, black resistance movements have also been faced with addressing the question of intersectionality. Does anyone want to define what intersectionality is?
I think it's where I like to break it down to where it means like two things can be one. I am both black and woman, or I am both black and queer. I meet at the crossroad of who I am. That's what.
Did you want to add anything to that? Okay. So, as you mentioned, intersectionality is the understanding that individuals are made up of multiple identities, and that your experience in the world is born at the intersection of those identities. So, myself as a black man, while I experience racism just like a black woman experiences racism, she experiences a different form of racism because she's also a woman. Or additionally, if she's a black queer woman, she also experiences additional forms of oppression on top of that. And so this question of intersectionality brought about a new set of politics that helped to push a lot of our movements forward in being able to understand that although a lot of black resistance movements were leading revolutionary causes, a lot of them still struggled with the question of patriarchy and breaking down those oppressive forces. And this has been, the erasure that patriarchy creates has particularly been the case for black women and individuals of the black LGBTQ community. Because not only do we get very limited information in regards to the contributions of people in these communities and of these identities, but the goals and ambitions of our movement have often treated the existence of black women and black LGBTQ folks as an afterthought. And so this internal contradiction has birthed a set of politics and philosophies aimed at bringing to the forefront not only the contributions of identities that are often not centered, but also making sure that the goals and ambitions of our movements are inclusive of the existence and destinies of these individuals as well. So in the 1980s, you had movements like the womanist movement. And womanism was a term coined by Alice Walker to address the failures of mainstream feminist movements when it came to being inclusive of black women's intersectional experiences. An honest look at history will show that when black women fully assert their own humanity, both their blackness and womanhood, they have driven our movements to progress. When Sojourner Truth stood in 1851 at the Women's Rights Convention in Avon, Ohio, and delivered her women's rights speech in which she said, "I am women's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that?" She was asserting her black womanhood by reminding everyone that her blackness was once used to put her to work in the field and it didn't care for her womanhood. She had to work as hard or even harder than men, so why can't her womanhood be respected now that she's free? What we have to understand is that men within black resistance movements have a responsibility to respect the full humanity of black women and of those of undergender identities. But these members of our community do not need our permission to assert their own humanity or existence. So just as it is within their right to organize against racism, it is also within their right, as they have always done, to organize against misogyny and sexism and patriarchy. And as men, if we do not want to be treated as the enemy, we must take action and act as allies to the struggle. When the Black Panthers took a progressive stance on women and gays' rights, it was in part because the leadership was progressive, but also because women and queer members of the organization asserted their humanity and forced the organization to take a progressive stance. Members like Afeni Shakur, who was part of the Black Panther Party in New York, was a strong advocate for gay rights and pushed for it to be included in the politics of the organization. Afeni Shakur credits much of this to her time spent in the Women's House of Detention, where during the night of the Stonewall riots, the women in the detention center held their own protests in support of gay rights. And this inspired Afeni to learn more about this movement and to support it. This also speaks to a necessary understanding about the scope of black resistance and truly any resistance movement, and that is that the prison industrial complex is also a battleground for resistance. Understanding that the prison system evolved out of the system of slavery, we understand that the prison was not created to serve the purpose of carrying out justice, but to serve the purpose of the capitalist system for free labor by targeting the most vulnerable communities in our society, who are often poor and black. This understanding made it necessary for any black resistance movement in recent history to also advocate for the abolition of the prison system. Resistance against the prison system has happened both from the inside and the outside. From the inside, inmates have led and built their own resistance movements that often result in prison uprisings, such as the Attica Prison Rebellion of 1971, where over 1,000 inmates rebelled against the inhumane conditions of the prison. From inside, individuals like George Jackson contributed greatly through his writing to the political and theoretical foundation of the movements of the 60s and the 70s, and ultimately lost his life in a prison uprising as well. George Jackson was not only a revolutionary, but he was a political prisoner. And although he wasn't originally imprisoned for his political beliefs, he was certainly kept there because of them. Prison has not only been used to oppress communities, but also to kill movements by imprisoning those who dare to resist. In response to this, a key development in black resistance has been the struggle to free political prisoners. And this is something that gained widespread popularity in the late 60s and 70s with campaigns like the Free Huey movement after the chairman of the Black Panther Party was in prison. Individuals like Angela Davis had been at the forefront of not only the prison abolitionist movement, but also the movement to free political prisoners. Today, organizations like the Jericho movement continue to fight to free political prisoners and revolutionaries that are still behind bars. People like Mumia Abu-Jamal, Shaka Shakur, and many more, often who are now elderly and dealing with health complications from being denied treatment behind bars. For black people in America, we understand that our existence is enough for us to end up in prison or in jail. And so by nature, many of us are political prisoners waiting to happen. And for those of us who are ever audacious enough to decide that we want to be revolutionaries, there are two things that are almost certain for us, usually the cell or the grave. if we ever hope to continue the legacy of black resistance, but more importantly, if we ever hope to win the struggle, we have to abolish the institutions that stand in the way of liberation for black people. And the prison system is at the center of these institutions. And so if you ever find yourself uncomfortable or opposed to the idea of prison abolition because you believe that you are someone who is concerned with justice or making sure that criminals are put away, I want you to understand that a black person who could read was once considered a criminal. I want you to consider that police and ICE are killing people every day without reason, and none of them are sitting in a jail cell or in prison. So really think about whether or not you're comfortable with the idea of letting this country tell you who is and isn't a criminal, or what justice is when over 50% of the people who are pardoned for being wrongly in prison are black. Prison abolition does not mean a society without a justice system, but it condemns what we know to be a society with an injustice system. And that concludes my presentation on the philosophies and politics of black resistance. And so now I would like for us to engage in a conversation about, well, one, your thoughts on all of the things we've heard. We also have readings, if you didn't see them when you came in, that you're free to pick up. But one, to engage with your thoughts on these different philosophies and politics of black resistance, but also how we see that we can apply these politics today. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of people are having conversations about resistance with the current federal administration. And for those of us who are organizers and are avid learners of history, we understand that, as someone said, the America that we see is not a product of Trump, but Trump is a product of America. So we have to understand that when we are resisting against the Trump administration is not enough. It has to go much, much deeper than that. And so this is the conversation that I would like for us to have. Anyone is free to start, get us kicked off. Any questions, any thoughts, anything you just would like to share?
First, I want to say thank you, Fidelis. That was a wonderful presentation. Also, I'm just really appreciative of all that I have learned in the last year, from the book clubs and things. I never knew how strong I could be until I started reading these books. Especially with this current book we're reading, Revolutionary Suicide, where Huey P. Newton, it's kind of basically his biography, but he, in the opening, I can't think of it verbatim, but when he gives the definition of a revolutionary and what it means, it's a very sobering thought as to the sacrifices that will have to be made in order for us to live freely. But I think about this daily, and I just feel like with what all is going on, we're just really ready for something different. But I'm always worried about the Judases, the people who are either just too far gone into capitalism or those who are just too scared, you know what I'm saying? So, what else? I think that's just a couple of thoughts, things that run around in my mind. I didn't have any question or anything yet.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to second the importance of reading and knowing history. I think a lot of people take for granted the privilege to be able to read and to be able to read anything that you want. A lot of these books are available online for free that you can just download. One of which that I highly recommend is What Is to Be Done. by Lenin, in which he breaks down what a vanguard is. He kind of addresses that question about like what do we do about those who maybe out of ignorance or malicious intent want to break down the movement and like sell people out. And it was actually not his idea, but what he proposes or what he like says that's why the movement has to be like made up of revolutionaries who are not like revolutionaries who are dedicated to this work and also those who are professional. So in the same way that we have professionals in different jobs, we too have to expect that those who are leading our movement are professionals and proficient at their work. And he also talks about the different aspects of the vanguard, but essentially things like selling out individuals or like specifics about like how we have plans. These are things that must be professionally created through people who dedicate their whole lives to doing revolution, and that really helps to safeguard against bad actions or safeguard against like plans that are like half-baked. So I really recommend people to read What Is to Be Done. It's really great.
Yeah, that is definitely on my list. And to add to that, one of the reasons why I believe that the work that we do is important, and the reason why we try to provide readings at every one of our events, as she said, it's a privilege to be able to read. And I think that it is ignorant for anyone to try to lead, create, or get involved with a movement if they're not politically educated as well. Education, as Malcolm X says, is the passport to the future. You have to know what it is that you come from. You have to understand the systems that you're dealing with. And, Angela Davis once said that, systems are a creation of historical forces. So if you don't understand history, you can't understand the systems that you're up against, right? And one of the ways in which we do that is, through this idea of historical materialism, which is a way in which you study history to understand the social forces that you're dealing with, whether it be capitalism, whether it be imperialism, colonialism, etc., to understand the historical forces that produce these systems that are in place, and then to help you understand how we can combat these systems. And so, we do things like, of course, the book club is where we have an opportunity to really get in depth with these ideas and to really study these ideas to a point where anybody can hopefully leave the book club with an understanding of how they will go out into the world and be able to carry forward, a revolutionary life. Because as she said, this is something you have to be dedicated to. People often ask me all the time, like, how do you have time to do all the stuff you do? And I was like, I've built my life around this. I don't see myself doing anything else. At the center of my life is revolutionary work, and everything else is secondary. So anything else that comes into my life takes second place to this work. And as she said, that's because we need people who are fully dedicated. This is not something you do as a hobby. It's not something you do when you have time. You make time if you really care about freedom. And one of the things that really changed my perspective on that was when Malcolm X said, if you're afraid to die, take the word freedom out of your vocabulary. And I think instantly the fear of death left my mind and my body when he said that. Because I had to understand, how much do I really want freedom? And how much am I willing to give for freedom? And so, and I think that one of the things, and one of the reasons why even, when I said that, even Milledgeville can produce revolutionaries, I think it was important to state that because I think, especially looking at our local community, there's a lot going on in our local community right now on many levels. And I think that one of the things, a lot of times people get lost in hopelessness. People get lost in the idea that they can't do anything because they come from a certain place or their access to certain things is limited. But I think that it's important to remember that revolutionaries of the past did more with less. right? We have much more information at our fingertips. We have much more access to resources than revolutionaries of the past, and yet we seem to be doing much less with it. And so I think that that is to be an indictment on us as those who, we say that we want freedom and we say we want to fight for freedom and a better world. We really have to ask ourselves, what are we doing with what it is we have access to? And so I think that the point that you made was very important, and I think that I hope that that sticks with all of us in this room. Is everyone isn't going to contribute in the same capacity, but what you can contribute with your whole heart and contribute with all that you got, because that's the only way we're going to make this work. So yeah, just wanted to add to that.
Can you give me that lady's name real quick again?
From the one who was from Milledgeville, Salaria Key, Salaria, and her last name is Kea. Yeah, definitely read up on her.
Gonna echo. Gonna turn on.
Echo the thanks, Fidelis, for everything you touched on today. On the topic of reading and organizing, my reading, besides the book club this month, has been Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is first-hand accounts of women in SNCC. And it has been so good for placing it in all these small places. People who didn't come from the professional side but found themselves willing to sacrifice their schooling, put themselves in harm's way, and to respond to the urgency of what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Absolutely.
Great. First off, I want to say thank you for that presentation. One quote that I continuously think about when it comes to revolution and seeing what not just I as an individual, but we as a collective can do is, if you stand for anything, you will fall for everything. So I really think that breaks down to you as an individual have to understand what you are following and what you are understanding, so that way we as a collective know better and can do better as one and can move as a whole unit. That way things don't get misconstrued or miscommunicated amongst everyone as the general population.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that quote makes me think about is the fact that a lot of times, even recently with several different elections that have been happening, and people who have taken a very principled stance on electoral politics in our country, and a lot of these folks have been met with criticisms such as, oh, well, you're being a one issue, voter, you're being this, you're being that. And I think that that just speaks to the fact, like you said, that there are a lot of people who don't really stand for anything. There are a lot of people that will make as many concessions as they need to make because they don't really believe in freedom. They just want things to be quiet, right? They don't want to, right? They don't want to upset the status quo of things, right? They don't care. They don't really care if people of certain communities are being abused. They just don't want to see it. And so one of the things that that also makes me think about is Dr. King once did an interview when he said that when he was leading these marches in the South, and he was saying that the liberal white folks were really not, they were upset at the fact that of the extremism of people like Bull Connor. They were upset at the police coming out and beating black people, but they weren't really committed to the idea of equality. They weren't really committed to fixing schools in the black community. They weren't really committed to providing quality public facilities, for people in the black community. They just didn't want to see the brutality, right? And I think that that's one of the things that, many of us have been very critical about with recent elections, is that you have many people that it's like, I don't know if you're really committed to justice more than it's like you want it out of sight and out of mind. If I don't have to see, immigrants being rounded up on TV every day and on social media, then I don't have to think about it. So I would rather have somebody in office that's still going to deport them, just don't put it in my face. All right?
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, because this whole, ever since Trump has gotten elected, I feel like people have started to kind of see Trump as an antichrist or something above, more than him just as a human, that he's somehow above the reality of the situation. No, Trump is, first of all, the country is not run by one person. There are several people, and it's supposed to be run by corporations. And so when people are like, oh, we have to get to the polls and vote him out, is voting out Trump going to change the situation that we are currently living under, or is it just going to be a different flavor? Because, I had a family friend who had to self-deport in 2011. No wait, yeah, 2000. Right when Obama first got elected, and this is everybody's favorite guy. Everyone loves Obama, but no, he was deporting a lot of people. A lot of people got deported. A lot of children were put in cages under Biden at the end of Obama's term. So it's just do you actually care about immigrants, and do you actually care about families getting split apart from deportation, or is it just the way that it's being done, or is it just because it's on social media? And as long as it's not on social media, like you were saying, do you actually care about these people who are being deported?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that also, for me, leans into the conversation of, whenever these things come up and we want to have these conversations, and people say, well, now's not the time, right? We gotta vote out this person. Now's not the time. And again, it goes back to the conversation of reform versus revolution, because the infrastructure for what Trump is doing now had been there before he got in office. So somebody created that infrastructure, and then he used it for what it was created for. So, one thing I always say is that a good politician is never going to be able to change the system, but a bad one will always take full advantage of it, because the infrastructure is there already. And so, as she said, voting out one person is not going to do the job. You can vote out 100 people, and it's probably not going to do the job. But you have to change the complete infrastructure that exists that makes these things possible. And so that's an important thing to remember. And I think that this can kind of segue us into the conversation of all the things that we talked about in this presentation. What are you all's thoughts, you all's ideas on the applications of these philosophies, of these politics? It could be the ones that stood out to you the most, the ones you may be already most familiar with, but just thinking about the current situation we're in now, when you walk out of this room and you take them with you, what are the practical applications of these politics and philosophies in your life and in whatever organizations you participate in, whatever resistance movements that you contribute to, or that you would like to contribute to, and hopefully this inspires you to get involved. What do you take from it, and how do you see these things being applied in our current context and situation?
I think that organization, as you mentioned from the jump, is the most important thing. As Fidela said, we're open for new membership. We want to learn, we want to teach, we want to reach, we want to get with the people. Also, there has to be a lot of decentering white supremacy in a lot of people's mind. Like you have to no longer desire to lean on this system, and so it's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. When you mentioned Trump, the Antichrist, when he ran the first time and this time, you could tell that they were putting him on a Christ-like pedestal. You know what I'm saying? We are a very, air quote, religious country, but yet there's not an official religion of America. It's unofficially Christianity, Christian nationalism, to be honest. And I think, like I said, it's got to be a lot of decolonizing, decentering, and deconstructing, especially religion. Forgive me, but you have to, I'm just being real, because of that stronghold that religions in general have had on us. This is why they've been able to put him into this position. This is why you see a lot of people who look like us still supporting him, because they still support white Jesus. Quiet as it's kept. Okay, all right.
Yeah, and to add to that, one idea that I didn't have the chance to include in this presentation, but I think is appropriate for discussion, is to that point. I think that religion has become one of those things that is so embedded in our world that I think realistically we have to understand how to use it as a tool for liberation as well, right? So there's the concept of liberation theology that exists, which means to explore theology, explore religious belief, faith, the constructs of religion, as it pertains to the liberation of oppressed people. And we can see this throughout many aspects when you think about individuals like Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, who, when they led and organized the slave revolts and uprisings, they were deeply Christian and credited their Christian beliefs to them wanting to carry out these actions. You look at individuals like Malcolm X, who's very, deeply religious in his faith, or even organizations like the Nation of Islam, that they sort of created their own Islamic infrastructure. It's not orthodox, Islam, but nonetheless, they used the faith as a tool for organizing and mobilizing black people during that time. And so I do think, to your point, I agree that there has to be a deconstruction. I think a decentering is going to be much more difficult, but I think that as organizers, one of our jobs is to understand how to use all the tools at our disposal to reach people where they are. And so, as much as conservatives and fascists want to characterize Jesus in a way that serves as a means to their ends, I think that we can also look at the life of Christ and the life of the Prophet Muhammad and other, even traditional African spiritualities have been used in revolutionary movements. And so all of these things can be used and characterized within the context of revolution. I mean, you can look at Jesus as a revolutionary, and you can place Christianity in a revolutionary context. And many, liberation movements have used religions as the foundation. And so I think that it's important that we also understand that aspect of it and be able to use it. And as I mentioned, I think it's just it starts with education. It starts with education. It starts with people understanding. I think the reason why conservatives have been so successful is because they have convinced people that religion should not be political, right? And so I think that our job is to make people understand that religion is political. Religion has always been political. Every religion is political, and so every religion has political foundations. whether that be Christianity, Islam, or whatever else. And so I think that once we accept the political nature of religion, I think it makes the job much easier to be able to organize people using something that is so close to their hearts, which is their faith. We know that the civil rights movement would not have had the reach that it did without the organization of the black church, right? And so, so those are things that I think we can look at in history and understand that these things can also be used as organizing tools, but we just have to be careful. We just have to be careful with that. But I think that it's possible. But I do agree with what it is that you're saying as well. Because even something like this, there's only two places that let us congregate, and that is the barbershop and this church. So, but I would say this church is not like many other churches. So, but their politics are different. So that's what it is. Right, anybody else? The rest of y'all can talk too, right? We got like the same 4 or 5 people.
Alright, so the main thing that I'm gonna be thinking about when I leave here, and is I've been thinking a lot about like how you engage with politics and how the people in my everyday life, they so dejected from it. And I think a lot about like why. Like, and it's like after centuries and after decades of so much pain and suffering, we had 3 deaths in the community in the last week that really had me thinking like real hard. Like, this is something that back in the day, if y'all don't know, people were literally going up against these automobile companies, especially Ford, because they were purposely making cars unsafe and people were dying in accidents, but the folks are not kidding. And I'm like, dang, so after all this time, I understand how all that pain and all that tragedy makes it so easy for you to accept what's being done to you. But now, you talking about self-determination, I'm like, what if it's not just nihilism? Or what if under that nihilism, it's a lack of self-determination, or a lack of expressing your self-determination? Like, how do we update our movements now to combat that? Because that's the main thing that's keeping people from being in a space like this. Is, oh, the Epstein file came out. We already knew this was going on for years. Like, what are we supposed to do about it? Like, okay. Like, come on. So I'm like, I'm thinking real hard about it now. Like,
yeah, and I'll tell you, that was one of the main reasons why we created the new Vanguard, is because we realized that people are disengaged from politics. And I think one of the reasons, there's a few reasons for that. I think, number one, I think the biggest overarching reason is the fact that when you look at a lot of the revolutionary movements that were happening, when those movements were eradicated, whether that's through leaders being put in prison, whether that's people being assassinated, or these organizations being dismantled, I think that the strongest factor in what killed a lot of the revolutionary drive in oppressed communities is capitalism. I think that what this country realizes is that you can kill a movement easier with money than you can with a gun. If you can buy out and identify, because I think what people don't realize is that, I'll give you a perfect example. I don't remember the lady's name, but when Breonna Taylor had passed away some years ago, there was a lady who was, she was going real hard for justice for Breonna Taylor. I forget her name, I wish I could remember. And she was going really hard, and she had a whole thing going, and then next thing I know, I see her in a Chevrolet commercial. Yeah. I see her in a Chevrolet commercial. And I'm thinking to myself, what does this have to do with justice for Breonna Taylor? You know what I mean? What does this, I'll give you another example. When Kaepernick, and this is I still hold a grudge about this. When Kaepernick was kneeling, to me, there should not have, from that point on, when the NFL decided to blackball Kaepernick for kneeling against police brutality, there should not have been a single black person that would turn on the TV to watch the NFL another day in their life. And there you go. And they know what it did. They went and got Jay-Z and brought him in and said, we're going to let y'all sing and dance on stage during the halftime. and that's gonna make everything better. And black folks say that's good enough. And so I think that one of the things we have to realize is that a lot of us now, I can't really, to my knowledge, in the last couple of decades, I can't remember the time, where the United States on U.S. soil has had to fire a gun to kill a movement, but I can show you many examples of where they've used money in capitalism to kill movements, right? Black Lives Matter suffered from the same thing. Capitalism killing the movement. You know what I'm saying? So I think the thing that it comes down to is that there isn't a strong enough understanding and there isn't a strong enough counterculture that exists. I think that everybody, for the most part, in this country has become American and has become an American capitalist at heart. I don't think people, in the past, what kept these movements going is that they did not care to be American. They were very anti-capitalist, and their hopes was that the American empire would fall within their lifetime. I think many of us are hoping and praying that we can benefit from the American empire and American capitalism. Everybody's trying to get their piece of the American pie, right? And so I think that that's what it is. I think that ultimately people think that, well, if we don't disrupt, if we stay quiet, if we just continue to keep our head down and get our money, then we're gonna get what's owed to us. Somebody else to do it, right? And so that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is that you also have generations of people who have tried to engage with politics, and I would say not necessarily in a revolutionary way, but they have tried to engage with politics, and they've seen that time after time things have not changed, regardless of who they vote in, regardless of how many laws are passed and things are changed. They say, no, well, nothing is changing. And I think a lot of those people within their lifetime have not had the ability to see up close what a revolutionary movement looks like. They can only read about it. And one thing that I think is the responsibility of organizers, and especially why there's a necessity for a Vanguard, is that we have to show people in action what these things look like. When we talk about socialism, right, I don't just come in a room and talk about socialism, but I'm going to tell you how I built a community garden, right, to help feed our community. I'm not going to come in a room and just tell you about organization and revolutionary action, but we're going to bring the community in the room to put together a people's platform, right? So we have to carry out these practices, and I think that a lot of times we get caught up in trying to preach to people and not doing. And Fred Hampton said, we got to do less preaching and more practicing. You know what I mean? And so, Fred Hampton said, we're not just talking to the people about socialism, but we telling them, we fed 10,000 kids, this week in Chicago. So I think that we really have to get into the habit of putting our ideas into practice and making things happen. And I think that the reason why anyone who has been involved with anything that I've done has sort of had, I don't know if I call it a revelation, but eyes have been opened, because I think we've been able to see in real time that when we bring our heads and our hands together to do something, it happens. And so I would say to you, that's what people need to see. Those of us who have the ambition and the drive and the education, we need to start doing a lot more doing, right? We still got to talk, we still got to teach, because people need to know certain things so that they understand when we do certain things, this is why we do them. But they need to see these things in action, because, at the end of the day, everybody wasn't involved in the civil rights movement. Even though a lot of people would talk, oh, hey, back in the 60s, he wasn't there, he was in the house. He was in the house watching everybody else get sprayed and kicked and beat. But the people who were involved, right, the small number of people compared to however many other people they were able to come together to push for those changes and those wins that they were able to get. So it doesn't take everybody at the end of the day, but it just takes enough of us who are dedicated strongly enough to be able to make these things happen. And I think that is possible, and that's why I always try to host these events and try to bring out especially young people, and provide a space for us to have these conversations, because I don't know any other organization within maybe a 30, 40-mile radius that is talking about what we're talking about, you know. And so there's a void that we have to fill in our community, and so we've taken on that responsibility and we're doing it. And hopefully that inspires people to do the same. Yes. Please.
Hey everybody, my name is Treasurer Felton, and I'm so glad to be here. But I've been a revolutionary since I was born. I've been waiting on something like this, even though I've been a part of many. I didn't know how to join the new Vanguard.
Oh yeah.
I don't know, but I'm willing. I mean, it don't matter. I'm willing to die, so it doesn't matter. I'm letting you know that now. I'm willing to die.
I got
So,
your number.
You got my number.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm just letting you know I'm willing to die for what I believe in, and I'm willing to fight for that. And Milledgeville needs this change. Change. I do know certain people, like I know the niece of Huey Newton, Mr. What's it, Newton? I know the niece. She lives here. You might want to get her to speak. But I'm just saying that there's a lot of people that's kind of like underground, but I know a lot of those people. So I just want to be a part and just show me what y'all want me to do.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
I'll do it.
Yes, ma'am. I got your number. I'll get with you.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Thank you. No, thank you for coming.
Oh yes, I told you I was.
Yes.
I just woo.
I know this rain. Yeah,
The rain, but
yeah.
still, I mean.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, Gail Young. I have to just have to say I admire what you're doing. It's great work, you know, talk about you a lot. You always want somebody talking about you when you're not in spaces, but you know, I see that you're doing great work and I respect what you're doing. And I also, you know, appreciate what you said about people, you know, committing to something and giving their all to whatever part that they want to commit to. I'm a person that's going to get in where I fit in, regardless of what it is. I have to decide what I want to do and what I want to be a part of. My whole goal and mission since returning personally, you know, I lead myself first. That's what I'm here to do, is lead myself and make sure that I'm going into the right direction, you know, where I can make the most difference in my community. You know, I've decided to come back here and stay here and work here, and you know, just trying to figure out. But the first thing is to just find unity in the people. And from what I'm seeing, you know, Trump is the, you know, symptom of something that's been going on in this country for, you know, since its inception, and that is, you know, getting free labor and labor at the lowest cost for capitalism, of course. But the thing that is very concerning, and the thing that, you know, I just want to reach these people, is 90 million people that stayed at home and that does not think that, you know, their vote matters, or, you know, that anything that's going on is of concern to them. I have friends like that I talked to, or I just hung out last night with a childhood friend. I grew up here. I was born and raised here. And a childhood friend, I said, hey, you gotta see, you know, I mean, they don't, what's going on in the news, the tariffs and everything, how the Supreme Court kind of overruled and all of these tariffs and things. I had no idea. Don't watch news. Don't want to watch news. Too stressed to watch news. Too busy working to watch news. Too busy living life to be concerned with what is going on around them. That's apathy. You know, people are not engaged. So, I mean, I'm just wanting to figure out a way that, like, the community of people that are engaged here in this local community, Milledgeville, where I was born and raised, are aware, like, get the information, you know, get the education, are not ignorant to the fact. Dr. King said the two most dangerous things are sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And there's a lot of that going on today. So for me, I'm just trying to figure out how I can, you know, be a bridge. you know, I understand concerns about Judas and everything. That's definitely, people don't trust each other.
Yeah.
Like, if I go over here talking to these people about trying to unite with these people and get the word out to the people, oh, well, I don't know, that person is this, that, you know, so that's, we gotta get rid of that. We gotta we gotta find, like, on the Venn diagram, what is that portion that we can all work together on to do what is right and what is just for the people. So that's where I stand with everything. I'm not sure, like, that I would classify myself as a revolutionary, but I think that a lot of revolutionaries throughout history may not have known, but they stand up and they do what is right at the time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's where I see myself. The more I learn, the more I grow, the more that, you know, I find out where I fit in this whole thing called life. That's where I shall be. So I just want to do good, and I want for other people to see the good in others, and, you know, to kind of get outside of our narrow focus and say, hey, you know, is there something that I can get with that person with? I might not understand or believe everything that they do, but hey, can we work together for this to improve things?
Yeah, and I would say, I definitely agree. I think that there is, particularly when it comes to voting, I think that with a lot of people, you know, they definitely do not feel that their votes count. And I think especially on the federal level, it's hard to tell that to people. I think, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I think we focus a lot on local politics. Because one, local politics, you can affect quicker change at a local level. And I think that a lot of times what it takes is to be able to give people some tangible wins that can serve as a buy-in. And I think also another thing that could contribute to that is that people who have really not seen anything different. I think that when you have organizations who all they've done is knock on people's door to register them to vote and tell them to vote, but there is no programs, there's no initiatives in the community, there are no other things going on outside of voting. I think that's where the problem comes in, because I mean, when we think about it, a large part of the 60s was organizing people to vote, right? Kwame Ture, you know, went down to Sunflower County, Mississippi with Fannie Lou Hamer and organized the Lowndes County Freedom Party, which inspired the Black Panther Party, you know. And so I think that voting, and I think also we have to understand what they were organizing to vote locally as well. I think that people have this misconception that folks in the 60s were dying to vote for the president, and that's not necessarily the case. They wanted to be able to make sure that their sheriff wasn't a racist. You know, they wanted to be able to make sure that their mayor wasn't a racist. You know, and so I think, again, it goes back to a re-education process, because I think that people, one, misunderstand what ends certain methods are meant to serve. And then I think, secondly, we also have to figure out how to show people something different. Because if people continue to see the same thing over and over again, they're gonna go right back to saying, well, it doesn't matter anyway, ain't nothing changing. You know, and I think that, you know, George Jackson said that if revolution is based on, you know, long-range politics, then it's not gonna matter to the people who are gonna die tomorrow. You know, and a lot of people, you know, are dealing with life or death situations, whether it be food insecurity, whether it be the inability to pay rent, or, you know, whether it be homelessness, these kinds of things. And I cannot, for me personally, on an ethical level, go to these people and tell them that registering to vote and voting is going to change that situation. You know, and so what I would rather do is figure out what can we do as a community to bring people out of these situations, and then be able to engage them in these things, you know, whether it's, you know, voting, especially on a local level, or, you know, these other things that we would like for people to engage with. And even I think people who, and I do agree that there are people who are in much more privileged positions that still sit at home and do nothing. And I think that at the very least, if you're gonna say, well, I'm not gonna do this, then tell me what you are gonna do, right? And I think that's the conversation we also need to start having with people. I think that a lot of times the conversation ends at, well, this person said they're not gonna vote, and then the conversation kind of ends there, where I think that we need to start engaging people in alternatives as well, saying, okay, well, if you're not gonna do this one thing, what are you gonna do? What can we get you to do, right? What do you feel that would be useful? And I think that sometimes that's what a lot of people are looking for. People don't feel heard. You know, people don't feel like anyone is really interested in what they have going on. And so I think that, you know, we sort of have to reimagine the way that we're having conversations around certain things and try to figure out how we can best engage people. And like I said, you know, we're not going to get everybody, but I think that if we make an intentional effort to get people who may be sincere enough, I think that we will accomplish a lot more than we have in the past. And so I do agree with you. I think that we have to be committed to going out and reaching people. And also, I know a lot of people be scared to talk to their own people. People are scared to go into poor neighborhoods. People are scared to go, you know, people will not, they're going to go into the middle class neighborhoods and the well-off neighborhoods and tell you, you got to get to the vote and da-da-da, and nobody's talking to the poor people. You know, and so, you know, poor people have realized nobody come and talk to us. They don't ever care about us until it's time to get some votes. You know, and then nobody talks to us again for another 4 years. So I think that, you know, it's hard to engage people also when people have been used as a means to an end. And I think that that's one of the main issues I take a lot of times with voting drives and those kinds of things is that, you know, you're only engaging with these people once every election cycle. And people are not really, that's like somebody coming here every time they need something, but they don't, you know, check on me in between or anything else. So.
But again, that's the education piece, and another thing that I see and I admire in you and you guys coming to like the commission meetings and the city hall meetings. Once the people elect someone into a position, it is on the people to hold those elected officials accountable. And that's what, you know, I see that you all do very well. They might not want to see you coming, or they might have in their mind that it's like a negative thing towards something, you know, but that's how you do it. That's how you hold people accountable. So, you know, again, that it's going to take all things, but it's that engagement piece, and people just have to stay engaged. No, like you said, no matter what they do, stay engaged.
Stay engaged, and I think people have to be re-educated on what their civic responsibility is. You know, like I think a lot of people think that voting somebody in, that's the end of the work. You know, oh, I voted for this person, I did my part. Did you? But when they did something that was not for the people, did you hold them accountable? You know, and I think that that's part of it too. I think, you know, and it's, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, wow, I gotta do all that. Well, that's what you're supposed to do. You know, your boss doesn't stop checking in on your work after they hire you, right? So you're gonna get performance reviews and all these other things. We have to treat politicians the same way. You have to understand that you hire these people, your tax money is what pays these people, and is what pays for the things that they make decisions on, and so why not make sure that you hold them accountable? You know, and if you can't go in there and hold them accountable yourself, then make sure that you are part of a group of people that is doing that, so that your voice can be heard, so that when there are things that you're concerned about, somebody is there to speak on your behalf. And so I think that we've just lost the civic engagement. People don't really understand how politics is supposed to work. You know, Kwame Ture says, you know, you vote once every 4 years, and you think that's the end of your political responsibility. Politics is every day, you know, so those people, they wake up and make decisions every day, so you better make sure when you get a chance to hold them accountable and have your voice heard, you need to be there. And I think that that's, you know, that's how it needs to be communicated to people. And I think that also we need to re-educate people on our relationship with politicians. Right? Politicians are not above us, right? We don't follow politicians, they follow us. So you should not treat a politician like you treat a celebrity. We should not treat celebrities like we treat celebrities, but you know, you should not be ride or die behind a politician that person is there to represent your wants and your needs, right? So they should be routed out behind you. And if they are not, then you get them out. So, I think that's, that's one of the things we also have to, people have allegiances to politicians and to political parties when it should be the other way around. Those political parties should be fighting to get your support, and they don't, and because they understand that they don't have to. You've already pledged, you've already said, I'm a Democrat, I'm a this, I'm a whatever, I'm a ride behind this person or that person. And, that lets me know you're not really going to hold them accountable then. You haven't asked anything of them in exchange for your vote, So, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to create the People's Platform, is to say that people should be getting something out of their vote. There should be something going on. People, when somebody comes and stands in front of you and says, I want you to vote for me, you should be able to ask them why. And then they tell you, and they tell them, well, this is what I want for that vote. Especially in the poor community, the black community, where polling stations are however many miles away from your house, and you got to take time off work and go stand out there. Sometimes you might not even be able to vote because the line is too long. You got to go through all these hoops just to vote. You might as well make it worth something. And I think that people are not comfortable enough with being disruptive, and that is also part of the problem. People think that keeping things calm and peaceful is the way. We gotta have civil discourse, and no, you gotta get uncivil sometimes. You gotta get rowdy sometimes. You gotta go in them county commissioners meetings or city council meetings and yell and say all the things you need to say and make them feel uncomfortable. So yes, I love it when they feel uncomfortable when we walk in the room, because that lets me know that we're not the ones to play with. And I hope that everybody takes on that mindset. When you walk in the room, they should feel like they cannot play with you. I remember the first time we had one of these meetings and we had county commissioners in the room. I won't say their names, but they felt very uncomfortable in that room. They felt very uncomfortable in that room. They said, well, you didn't want to invite us, you didn't want us in the room. Well, you can be here, it's a community meeting. I don't have to invite you personally. You're not the vote. Right, this is your community. You can come into the meeting. I gotta extend you. Are you the king or something? So they gotta understand that we're not treating you any more special than I treat my neighbor. You know what I mean? So if you respect this community, you will show up as a community member, and you will engage with us as community members. Otherwise, this is not room for you to be in. Point blank, period.
I was just gonna add, I have a couple thoughts. One, I think Democrats have gotten so comfortable with the vote blue no matter who, that the other guys are always going to be worse, and they don't have to do anything to earn that vote. That is just a guarantee that they're better, which they're the same party. They're still in the party. Everybody's just working for the same goal. Like we said, the corporations are controlling it. So they have that accountability has to start before the vote. I'm getting so many texts from John Ossoff. I'm like, what have you done to earn that? It's just the boogeyman. But anyway.
Yeah.
But the other thing I think is kind of what you were talking about at the barbershop last month, of how everything's become really sanitized. I think revolutions become very sanitized, of just go protest. And those protests, they're permanent. The police are there, it's a pre-planned, this day, this time for 2 hours, and then we all go home. Who is that disrupting? Nobody in power is going to be impacted by that. It's not, at worst, it might impact negatively your movement, because you're impacting other working class people. And I think there's so many more creative ways that we have of disrupting. There was a movement when ICE was staying in hotels in Minnesota. People were making reservations and canceling them the night before, so they lost all their money at those hotels. And that's so easy to do, but it's such a creative way of hitting them where it actually hurts in their money. And I think that's the kind of thing that I want to do more of, is find maybe less traditional or less sanitized ways of actually being disruptive. I think protests are a really good way to find community and to express feelings with like-minded people, but I think the government has become very comfortable with them and doesn't actually care unless we make them care.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And George Jackson said something where he said, when you go to a protest, you should be going with a clipboard and a pen in hand and pamphlets, because you should be recruiting. That's what protests should be for. But like you said, people go and we make noise for 2 hours and the police is there, and as long as we don't do anything that, breaks the ordinances, then hey, you know, police will let us do that. And I think, you know, the police is okay with you protesting. I don't know if I call it much of a protest. You know, so.
There's a difference between a protest and a demonstration.
Right.
A lot of them is demonstrations.
Right, exactly. So I definitely agree there. And I think that, like you said, you know, things have become very sanitized, especially because, you know, as Kwame Ture has an essay called The Pitfalls of Neoliberalism, where he says that liberals are often committed more to law and order than they are to justice. And law and order is always the law and order of the oppressor, right? And so they basically become the overseers of oppressed people, and to say that, you know, well, follow the rules and don't get disruptive, and, you know, eventually we'll get something accomplished. You know, and it's always that eventually, now's not the right time, now's not the time for the conversation, now's not the time to be critical, now's not, and it's like, well, when is the time? You know, because y'all are always running for something, there's always an election. So if election time is never the time, the time is never gonna come, you know, so.
You put that name again?
The essay?
Yeah.
The Pitfalls of Neoliberalism by Kwame Ture.
Yeah, and to add on like to the protesting thing, I think a big issue, and this is an issue with, I got my thing for that. A big issue with like movements in the US is that they are decentralized, and so you have a bunch of people doing individual, and this is what you talked about earlier, like collective resistance versus individual resistance. And when, like, okay, technically if 5 people are doing an act together, it's like not individual, but your impact is individual. Like I'm thinking, like I really came out organizing out of the Stop Cop City movement, in which there was just a bunch of direct action after direct action after direct action. It's just like when you're doing direct actions in isolation, outside of a large-scale campaign that has goals that you can measure, and that this campaign is done in context with multiple groups together, and it all culminates in one goal, you're not really making a lot of noise. So I'm thinking like you're outside and like you're making it difficult for this one hotel to like house these ICE agents. Like, is it really that difficult for, like maybe that hotel won't house ICE agents again, but now the government knows, or those hotels in the areas know, oh, like this is a tactic that people are doing. How can we avoid this in the future? And so it's like they already have your tactic. You've already used it once, and you've done it in isolation. So it's like we are giving away so many secrets for no good reason because we're all just trying to hit something at the wall and hoping that it sticks, versus thinking, reflecting on what has already happened and learning from it instead of repeating the same mistakes over and over and over, which is why it's so important that groups like the New Vanguard exist, because we do need organization as much as people tell us like that they're hierarchical and yada yada yada. Like, no, we actually do need organizations, and we need campaigns, and we need plans, and we need direct action. But I'm not willing to go to jail just because an ICE one ICE person is at this hotel, right? I'm willing to go to jail if it means like I can release 30 people out of prison. Like there's like a risk and like a reward and everything. I feel like right now we're taking hella risk for no reward. And there's a piece by Emma Cabral in which he talks about like, is it like claim no easy victories or something? Where he's talking about like we're getting high off of our own supply, off our own propaganda. Like we're publishing these pieces like, oh, Stop Cop City, like we've delayed construction. Yeah, you delayed construction for 2 years, but the facility's built. Like, are we really gonna claim that as a victory? No, like let's reflect and let's learn why Stop Cop City failed and, you know, not do it again.
Yeah, and I think to your point, you know, one of the things with almost everything I talked about in the presentation today is that it was tied to something bigger than itself, right? And like you said, you know, sure, we can get these small individual wins, but the system has enough money and enough power to like recover. And when they recover, they become much more sophisticated, right? And so one thing that I always say is the more we fail, the more sophisticated the system becomes. Because like you said, they're learning from our failures, but somehow we don't seem to be learning from our own failures.
Right.
And so to close, to close out and to kind of build on that point is that, there's a collection of essays called Malcolm X Talks to Young People, where I forget the exact name of this speech he was giving, but he talks about how when he was a part of, the Nation of Islam and just the civil rights movement in general, he talked about how the radical elements of the civil rights movement pushed the more liberal elements of the civil rights movement to be more progressive, and that the radical elements of the civil rights movement were pushed by the international revolutions that were happening. So again, what was going on in Africa, what was going on in Latin America, and what was going on in Asia. And I think that what has happened with a lot of our movements and organizations is that although we recognize on a theoretical level the importance of internationalism, we don't practice it. We don't engage in it practically, right? We don't have the same sort of exchange that was happening at the times where we really had successful movements. These movements, again, did not exist in isolation, because we have to understand that the United States, outside of being a nation, is an empire, and it has arms that extends and it draws resources and capital from other parts of the world. And so, as Huey P. stated, a national liberation movement is going to be very limited in what it can achieve if you're not also taking into consideration and acting practically within an international context. And so I think that, especially with things like Stop Cop City and ICE and all those things, what the anti-ICE movement is suffering from is the fact that they also did not support the anti-Zionist movement at the time that it was happening. They also did not support the abolish police movement. You have people now that are saying we need to get ICE of our cities, but you weren't supporting when people were saying abolish the police. ICE is also the police, right? So if we had abolished the police, we wouldn't get to the point where ICE is able to come into your cities and have contracts with your police. Because a bunch of counties in Georgia just signed contracts with ICE.
Or what about, why migrants are here in the first place?
Exactly.
What was that about?
So it's like all of these things that you previously did not engage with, that now you're engaging with because, ICE shot a couple of white people, and everybody else is looking at you like, we wouldn't be here if y'all would listen to us, So now it's like we're behind the curve on these actions because there were things that preceded them that had we acted at that point would have stopped us from getting to this moment. And so I just want to end us on that because I think it's important that we recognize that even if something is not directly affecting you, even if it's not knocking at your door at the moment, it does not mean that it won't eventually. So the best way to protect yourself, the best way to resist, is to engage in resistance movements that protect other people as well. All right? All power to the people.
All power to the people.
All right, thank you.
What's happening?